Did you like that funny video? What do you think about the King's video in return? Do you think they'll come back? I don't think so. That was a funny video though. All right, well, we're on page 32 in our social studies book. So if you would, please get your social studies book and please open it to page 32. We're going to talk about some more things that happened in the Revolutionary War today. Our 4 questions that are going to guide us today are this. What were some of the early battles of the Revolution? So we're going to talk about some of those battles. How did the American army compare to the British army? We'll take a look at that. What led the British to surrender? Surrender? You mean the British are going to surrender? Yeah, we're going to find that out today. And how did women help in the war effort? We'll find a lot more about that out. Maybe today and probably some later on too. All right, so we are looking at the Battle of Saratoga, the Battle of Yorktown, Redcoats, Treaty of Paris, and Valley Forge. So page 32 in your book. Here we go. When the war began, it appeared that the British had every advantage. That means they were probably going to win, in other words. They had a lot more chance of winning than the colonists did. Great Britain's army was large and well trained. There were already thousands of redcoats in the colonies when the war began. British troops were often called redcoats for their bright red uniform jackets. People on both sides of the Atlantic believed the colonists would lose the war. Well, that doesn't sound very positive, does it? Here we're fighting for our freedom. Are we going to have to go back to the king? It's kind of an uneven match. It seemed that the colonies were outmatched by the British. They did not have a real army. Each colony had a militia, but the men were not professional soldiers. They did not even have uniforms. I made us a little chart. Let me see if it'll let me go over to this chart. And let's write down some things on our little T-chart comparing the British Army and the colonial army. So the colonies didn't have a real army and no uniforms. Let's see if it'll let me go to this. Oh, yeah. All right, so we're going to write no real, I don't want to be underlining it here. No real army or uniform. Okay. See what else we can find out from our book. The Continental Army did have many strengths, though. One strength was George Washington. He was a fair-minded general, and his soldiers respected him. So let's add that to our chart here. They had old George. Are you underlining again? See if I can fix that real quick. There we go. They did have George Washington. Let's read some more. Another strength was the Army's belief in their cause. They were fighting for independence. We'll add that. Fighting for, we'll change it to freedom. They want to be free. Shortly after Lexington and Concord, the Americans fought against the British again. The battle was fought at Breed's Hill in Boston. The Americans were forced to retreat to nearby Bunker Hill. They put up a fight and proved they would not be easy to defeat. Okay, well, let's go back and talk about these. The British Army. Let's go up here and put it back in our chart. Okay, the British Army, the Redcoats. We read earlier they were the most... Why are you doing this now? Sometimes computers get on my nerves. Well, it says it's not, but it did. Okay. Most powerful, we'll fix it in a minute. Army in the world, we read earlier. Okay, and they had more soldiers. There were thousands of soldiers. They had better training. They had better weapons. What do you think about this? If you're looking at this, who do you think was tougher? Who do you think has a better chance of winning? The Redcoats or the Patriots. They've got the most powerful army. They don't have a unified army. Every colony just had a little militia. They had more soldiers. They had George Washington. They had better training. They're fighting for freedom. They had better weapons. And here's one more strength of the Continental Army. They were fighting. On their home turf. You know what that means? That means it was their land that the British had come to start fighting with them on. So think about somebody comes to your house. You're going to defend your house, aren't you? You're going to protect your family. So the Continental Army does have that strength because the British is here on their land. Let's go back to our book now. We're moving on to page 33, the British strategy. After the Battle of Bunker Breed's Hill, the British developed a plan to quickly win the war. Excuse me. Their plan called for cutting off communication between New England and the rest of the colonies. They believed the other colonies would surrender if they could not work together. However, Washington's army kept the British from taking control of New England. So they fought hard against the British and didn't let the British take control. Battle of Saratoga. In October 1777, the Continental Army won a huge victory against the British at the Battle of Saratoga in New York. The victory was a major turning point because it convinced the French to help the United States in the war. The French don't like the British anyway, do they? They took their land away in the French and Indian War. So now the French are like, hey, anybody who wants to fight with the British, we'll help them. So the French comes to help the United States. The French sent thousands of soldiers to help the colonists fight their common enemy. After the French troops arrived, the British changed their strategy. They believed many people living in the southern colony were loyalists. The British sent soldiers to these colonies to join the loyalists. So down in the south, the southern colonies, the British thought that most people down there were loyal to the king. So they moved their troops down there to start fighting down there because they thought there would be less people wanting to fight them if they were loyal to the king. So here's some battles. Started with Lexington and Concord, where the shot heard around the world was. 1775, Battle of Trenton on Christmas 1776. We'll read more about this very interesting event later. Oops, I skipped one. I'm sorry. Battle of Bunker's Hill. We just read about that. Then the Battle of Trenton. Then Saratoga, when they won a big battle and the French decided to help them. Go to the next page, 34. Winter at Valley Forge. Just 2 months after the victory at Saratoga, the Continental Army arrived in Valley Forge, Pennsylvania, to spend the winter. The army was tired and ragged after months of fighting. Rather than restoring their energy with food and rest, the army suffered greatly. The weather was harsh and the soldiers did not have enough food, shelter, clothing, or supplies. Imagine being somewhere where it's very cold. There's snow on the ground, the temperatures are below freezing, and you don't have any shoes. Some of the soldiers in the Continental Army, they didn't supply uniforms to them, and their shoes had just worn out from so much marching. So they were walking in bare feet in the snow. Some of them got frostbite. They didn't have enough food, so they're starving. They didn't have enough shelter, so they're standing outside or trying to sleep outside, or supplies. It sounds bad for us. General Washington tried hard to get help and supplies, but the Continental Congress did not have the money to provide for the army's needs. To make things worse, many of George Washington's men got sick and died that winter. Washington tried to hold his men together. He brought a Prussian military officer named Baron von Steuben to drill and train the soldiers on fighting techniques and strategy. The men practiced firing their muskets in new ways, and they learned how to charge with bayonets. That's that knife on the front of a gun. They had training and drills every day. A new army emerged in the spring. This new army was better trained and had more discipline. They were ready to take on the British and win independence once and for all. General Cornwallis led British troops to Yorktown, Virginia. and they set up camp along the banks of the York River. Now, I'm going to tell the story behind this. Remember the British troops had gone down south? Well, down in the south, there was a guy named Francis Marion, and he hated the British. And he was an old Cajun Southern boy, and he didn't like the British. And he said, I'm not going to march out there and fight against them with their fancy cannons and fancy guns. Here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to sneak up on them. We're going to stay in the swamps, and then we're going to hop out and attack them, and then we're going to run back in the swamps because the British are too scared to come in here where there's snakes and alligators, but we know how to get around them. And so Francis Marion became known as the Swamp Fox, and he would jump out at these British down in the south. He and his men would jump out. They would shoot at the British and surprise attack them, and then they would retreat back into the swamp, and the British wouldn't follow them in there. So they began to weaken the British army. And there was another officer named Nathaniel Greene in the South, and he had a funny strategy. He knew his men weren't strong enough. He didn't have enough men to fight the British. So he would shoot at them, and then he would run away, and the British would chase him. Then he would shoot at him, and then he would run away, and the British would chase him and his men. And he would fire at him, and he kept retreating. He kept retreating. Finally, the British had followed him around for so long, and they kept getting surprised by the Swamp Fox so many times. They were getting low on supplies. They were running out of bullets, and they were running out of food too. And so they need to go over to the ocean where some ships from England are going to come and bring them more ammunition, more supplies, more food. And so this is where this page starts. This is why General Cornwallis leads the British troops to Yorktown. Yorktown, Virginia is over along the ocean. They set up camp along the banks of the New York River. He did not know the American and French forces were headed there also to trap him. The French sent a great fleet of ships to block the British from escaping by water. While the French positioned their ships at the mouth of the river, General Washington and his army marched to Virginia from New York. The Allies then joined forces and surrounded the British at the Battle of Yorktown. The British troops could not escape. General Cornwallis had no choice but to surrender. On the next slide, I'm going to draw a picture for you and explain the very interesting Battle of Yorktown. It shows how smart George Washington was. Now, the British surrendered. Believe it or not, that means the war is over. I can't believe your social studies book only has less than 10 pages on the Revolutionary War, but don't worry, we're going to talk about it for a couple more weeks with some fun activities. But after the war was over, after the British surrendered, they had to sign the peace agreement, and it's called the Treaty of Paris. After the war ended, the United States and Great Britain signed the Treaty of Paris. They met in Paris and signed it. That's why it's called the Treaty of Paris. They signed it in 1783. Even though the Cherokees and other Indian tribes fought in the war, they were not invited to the meeting. Great Britain continued to control Canada, but the former 13 colonies were now recognized as an independent nation, the United States of America. We had to win the war to get our freedom, and we did. Now, there was a lot of so exciting, so interesting details that your book leaves off about the war. So even though this is the last book page on the Revolution, like I said, don't worry. I'm going to teach you a lot more about the Revolutionary War, stuff that is really, really cool. So I want you to go to the next slide today, and I want you to watch as I draw an illustration of the Battle of Yorktown.